has grown into the tender, if quick-tempered man-child his breeding blessed and cursed him to become. And only his affection keeps the cat alive, though more than once I've threatened violence. The brick and burlap in the river recompense for mounds of fur balls littering the house, choking the vacuum cleaner, or what's worse, shit in the closets, piss in the planters, mice that winter indoors safely as she sleeps, curled about a table leg, vigilant as any knick-knack in a partial coma. But Mike, of course, is blind to all of it. The gray Angora breed of arrogance, the sluttish roar, the way she disappears for days, sex desperate once or twice a year, urgently ripping her way out the screen door to have her way with anything that moves, while Mike sits up with tuna fish and worry, crying into the darkness, "Here, kitty, kitty," mindless of her whorish treacheries, or of her crimes against upholsteries, the sofas, love seats, wingbacks, easy chairs she's puked and mauled into dilapidation. I have this reoccurring dream of driving her deep into the desert east of town and dumping her out there with a few days' feed and water. In the dream, she's always found by kindly tribespeople who eat her kind on certain holy days as a form of penance. God knows, I don't know what he sees in her. Sometimes he holds her like a child in his arms, rubbing her underside until she sounds like one of those battery-powered vibrators folks claim to use for the ache in their shoulders. And under Mike's protection, she will fix her indolent, green-eyed gaze on me as if to say, "What are you gonna do about it, slick? The child loves me, and you love the child." Truth told, I really ought to have her fixed in the old way, with an airtight alibi, a bag of ready mix, and no eyewitnesses. But one of these days she will lie there and be dead, and choking back loud hallelujahs, I'll pretend a brief bereavement for my Michael's sake, letting him think, as he has often said, deep down inside you really love her, don't you, Dad? I'll even hold some cheerful obsequies, careful to observe God's never-failing care for even these, the least of his creatures, making some mention of a cat heaven where cat ashes to ashes, cat dust to dust, and the Lord gives and the Lord has taken away. Thus, claiming my innocence to the end, I'll turn Mike homeward from that wicked little grave, and if he asks, we'll get another one, because all boys need practice in the arts of love, and all their aging fathers in the arts of rage. So that was Ash Wednesday that year, and it didn't work the way I thought it would. And every time I read that, I think of my worry that the cat might live in 2 millennia, while Mohandas Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Mother Teresa, people you know, only lived in one. It was coming on to what we used to call Y2K, and I kind of thought of it as Y2Cat. And I remember calling my son in. We had gone to the vet. I had told him he'd have to take care of the cat, and that he'd have to be prepared to do the right thing for the cat. This was at Easter. He was away at college. He was coming home for Easter. I said, maybe Good Friday, Holy Saturday, you could come in and do the right thing by that cat, by which I meant you could take him to the vet and have him executed. And we met in the room at the veterinary surgeon's, Dr. Clark, the man I had to thank for by this time the cat was 21. The boy was the same age, he's going 40 now. So I did my part. But there we were in the little windowless room with sort of earth tone wall coverings and no windows. And I think it was Enya music being piped in from the source I couldn't figure out. And there was just the 5 of us, if you count the cat. There was Dr. Clark and myself. And Dr. Clark's rather comely young assistant, who I think had eyes on my son, himself a comely young man, him holding the cat in his arms, swaddled in a little blanket he brought. Oh well. And the doctor was saying all the right things, like, Mike, you've been such a good friend to Greta. That's the name of the cat. You've been such a good friend to Greta all these years. Perhaps a shot of cortisone would give her some relief in these, her final months. Months, said I. Myself, of course. I was kind of hoping for a dead cat today. I had zero balance my credit card. I knew there would be frequent flyers implicated in the transaction. I'd even gone to the trouble of having one of my factotums at the office, that's another calendar word, one of my factotums arranged for a little box for the occasion. It was at home in the garage waiting the pilgrim's sad return. And then they gave him, there was this terrible thing that happened. The comely young assistant was looking at my son, who was managing the emotional freight of all this, but you could see there was this one droplet of, it was a tear coming down his eyeball, out of his right eyeball onto his cheek, and the comely young assistant, who I still think had designs on Mike, had this panicked look on her face, and she was trying to catch the doctor's attention and nod to the weeping boy there with the cat in his arms. And that's when Dr. Clark said maybe 2 shots of cortisone would do. Anyway, I was not prepared for that, and they brought this vile-looking medicine in and shot the cat. I thought that'll kill it for sure, but it didn't. We took her home, and I thought, well, maybe they wanted to have a home death, the way, you know, it's all the rage now. But no. 2 hours later, she was sort of up and moving with a limp, but sort of jauntily and looking at me. By now, 2 days later, like I showed you, which of course she had. I let it go. I'm a member of one of those programs where you're supposed to fake it until you make it, thanks. And I let it go as they instruct us until later that year we gathered prior to Christmas, and I took my son in for another audience, and I told him that if whomever's in charge here, Mother Nature, Father God, you know, the source of reason in the universe, if the cat wasn't dead by New Year's Eve, I was going to take this stone, that rather tastefully engraved berry granite stone that said Greta, 1978 to 1999. I'd gone to the trouble of having it cut already, and it's, I should say, I get them on the cheap. I buy them wholesale. And, but even so, it wasn't the money. It was, as I told you, the idea that this cat might live into another millennium. It was like the existential anxiety I had about that. I thought, I'll drop that stone on the fucking cat and kill it dead. You know, he took me seriously. Because not long after that, he came home, and one afternoon he went out in the garden where my peonies used to spread around, and he dug a hole in the garden, and then he went back in the house and gathered up the cat and disappeared to Dr. Clark's office, I think, and came back in an hour with the cat still wrapped in that blanket, dead. And I'm always the last to know these things, apparently. My wife had laid in some finger foods and expensive drinks and, you know, music for the occasion, and my daughter was home, my other sons were home from their various pilgrimages, all their friends from school were home. There was a general air of desolation and free food. And then without a signal or any particular tuition, Mike went over and gathered up the cat, went over to the box, which I still had, and put the cat in the box and bent to the task of putting the top on it. And people turned naturally then and left. Whereas Michael picked up the box and went out to the hole he had made in my garden the day before, the grave, I guess. And I thought I should go with him, so I did. I walked with him and watched as he bent to put the cat in the box in the hole in the ground. And he stood up and he said, I'm really glad you were here to help me, as if I had done anything. It's kind of like that breathe, honey, breathe, we kept saying when they were born, like that helped. And then he said, but I have to do the rest of this alone. And I took that as a sign he wanted me to leave, so I did. And I turned back though, and I saw his shoulders shaking and his head sinking into them. And I felt very proud of him as he turned to the shovel work that is necessary when you dig a hole in the garden. And I thought, he's a better human than I am, and he must have learned that from me. It must have been a sign of good parenting, as any of us would think. And I wasn't disabused of that for most of the next year, when for my birthday that year, the brothers and the daughter got me a kitten for my birthday. One of those stripy little shits they call a tiger cat. They were calling it Amy, I was calling it Bruiser, and my sister stayed in the garage, and I was, taking out these very costly tins of designer cat food to it every morning, having those mindless conversations we have with small, helpless, furry things. I was saying things like, when I was your age, Bruiser, or you should have known Greta. There was a cat. She ate the food, seemed unimpressed with me, but I was also pleased to see my youngest son, Sean, going out in the afternoon, which is when he woke up, with another cat food, so much so that he began to think of Bruiser, he called her Amy, as his own cat. And things were going fairly swimmingly for, I suppose, the first 3 weeks we had that cat. And then my other son, the oldest boy, came home with this kind of, he lives away from home, he was a fishing guide, his only companion at the time, he's multiplied since, but at the time his only companion was sort of a wolfish-eyed Malamute or Husky or some dog with odd eyes and beastly habits. And they closed the truck, the dog jumped out of the back of it, and was working its way along the side of the garage when Bruiser, Amy, hearing the door slam on the car, probably thinking I was home, came toddling out of the garage to see the master return from his day of meaningful labor. And it was that time when the dog and the cat intervened in each other's ontological futures, or whatever they call it. Anyway, imagine the worst that can happen. Yep. And double that because, I think it was close to 10 o'clock at night when Sean came running upstairs saying, Dad, Dad, come quick. Tommy's dog is eating my cat. And double it again. There are, for the way those little droplets of blood that splatter on the wall, the white wall of the garage when the cat shakes it. I'm not going to get many poems read probably after I tell you. I'll try. And that poem of Dr. Williams's pertains about so much depending on a red wheelbarrow. I never got that poem until I saw those little sparkling blood spots on the garage door. And double it again because there I am out in the middle of the night in my boxer shorts digging a grave in the middle of the garden. And my son, who was a fan of Tom Waits, saying, why wasn't God watching? And there's no bottom line or Bible verse you can break out at such times, but it made me very glad to be a dad, although speechlessly and helplessly, as we always are. And it made me glad to be an undertaker because at least I know what to do with the dead thing. And both of these boys I was very proud of had figured out that when someone or something that we love dies, it's not how much we spend or how much we save, it's just what we do about it. That ours is a species that deals with the idea of death by dealing with the dead thing, And by getting the dead where they need to go, somehow the living get where they need to be. We've been doing this for more or less 50,000 years, depending on what channel you watch. I didn't get a headstone for the Bruiser. I figured, 3 weeks I was doing just fine, and then 21 days, where the other one was 21 years and I couldn't kill it. Who makes this shit up? It's kind of like the guy who said to Abraham, you're going to be the father of a nation, but there's this news I have about your tribesmen. I try to imagine them running off into the desert, said, man's a head case, Why not a secret handshake, or maybe a tattoo, or a nose ring? No, circumcision. They go right for the nuts of the matter. But anyway, I'll read another poem and get ready to sit down here. I was in Chicago last week, and spent some time around the wonderful museum, the Art Institute of Chicago. And this poem, which was written some years ago, is called Art History Chicago. It's not so much a Sunday afternoon on the island of La Grande Jatte as the point of order, according to Seurat, that bits of light and color, oil paints aligned in dots, become the moment caught, verbs slowed to a standstill, the life examined. We step back wide-eyed for a better look. An assemblage of Parisian suburbanites in Sunday dress, top hats and parasols, are there among the trees beside the river. There are girls and women, men and dogs in random attitudes of ease and leisure. A stretch of beach, boats in the blue water, a woman with a monkey on a leash, a stiff man beside her, a mother and daughter, that little faceless girl who seems to look at us, and everyone is slightly overdressed except for a boatman stretched out in the shade. He smokes his pipe and waits for passengers. I have never been to Paris. I've never holidayed beside the Seine nor strolled with a French girl in the gray morning, as in this Paris street, a rainy day, Gustave Caillebott's earlier masterpiece, 3 galleries down in this collection. So I do not know these cobblestones, this street, this corner. This couple seems intent on turning. But I've walked with a woman arm in arm, holding an umbrella in a distant city, and felt the moment quicken, yearning for rainfall or a breeze off the river or the glistening flesh of her body in water, the way this woman's is about to be, that Degas has painted in the morning bath. She rises from her bed, removes her camisole, and steps into the tub 100 years ago. History is a list of lovers and cities, a mention of the weather, names and dates of meetings in libraries and museums, of walks by the sea or through a city, late luncheons, long conversations, memories of what happened or didn't happen. But art is the brush of a body on your body, the permanent impression that the flesh retains of courtesies turned intimate, the image and likeness, the record kept, of figures emergent in oil or water by the river in the rain or in the bath when, luminous with love and its approval, that face, which you hardly ever see, turns its welcome towards you once again. I always find that Matthew was mentioning our erstwhile president. I was in Texas prior to being in Chicago, and I was out in Austin thinking of the former president and why, while I identify with him in some ways, I mean, we're both men of a certain age, you know, we're all both white and Christian, we have all the perks that come with those things, and he thinks the best day of his presidency was the time he caught an 8-pound bass. And I agree with him. I think it really was. Being in West Clare, working around the Frisians and the jackasses and the horses, I sometimes have a clearer view of our body politic, such as it is. This one is called, and it goes back to W's presidency. Dear Mr. President, the black cow we put inside for Mrs. Murray to inseminate got its head stuck in the metal gate and couldn't get it out. What was she thinking, we said to each other. Talk about a rock in a hard place. Maybe it swelled some after she forced it through. Still, we couldn't get it out, though we kicked with our boots, twisted it every which way, cursed, swore, shouted, prayed. Nothing worked. The thing was stuck, and we were stuck with it. How could we go back to our lives with that beast out there, its fat head caught in the gate? couldn't go to church or the movies or the store. What would we say when folks asked, how are things? As they do. In the end, we had to get a saw. One of those big round yokes that make an awful noise and cut through everything. After everything, we just had to cut it out. It was that simple, Mr. President. We just cut it out. One clean cut at the corner, bent it open until she pulled her thick head out and stood there looking like cows do, you know, blameless, serviceable, and dumb. Just in time for the bull, which comes in a suitcase now, says Mrs. Murray, the inseminator, wearing a blue rubber glove all the way up to her shoulder, pushing deep inside of that beast, all the while looking up into the high roof joists of the shed where swallows were nesting. The look on her face, Mrs. Murray's, was, I have to tell you, Mr. President, so sublime, so beautiful. We said, there is a science to everything. And this is a poem for a neighbor of mine, the last of his kind out in movie, maybe. It's called Himself. Some of you will recognize this life in lives of maybe your grandparents or your parents. Himself. He'll have been the last of his kind here then. The flagstones, dry stone walls, the slumping thatch, out offices and cow cabins, the patch of haggard he sowed spuds and onions in, all of it a century out of fashion, all giving way to the quiet, rising damp of hush and vacancy once he is gone. Those long contemplations at the fire, cats curling at the door, the dogs lame waltzing, the kettle, the candle, and the lamp, all still, all quenched, all darkened, the votives and rosaries and novenas, the Pope and Kennedy and Sacred Heart, the bucket, the basket, the latch and lock, the tractor that took him into town and back for the pension check and messages in the pub, the chair, the bedstead and the chamber pot. Everything will amount to nothing much. Everything will slowly disappear, and some grandniece, sister's daughter's daughter, one blue August in 10 or 15 years will marry well and will inherit it, the cottage ruins, the brown abandoned land. They'll come to see it in a hired car. The kindly Liverpudlian she's wed in concert with a local auctioneer will post a sign to offer site for sale. The acres that he labored in will merge with a neighbor's growing pasturage, and all the decades of him will begin to blur, easing as the far fields of his holding did, up the hill, over the cliff, into the sea. I don't want to overstay my welcome, Patrick. Do I carry on? Or
Tom, I think you're on extended time because Aiden has disappeared.
Well, more's the pity. So let's keep...
Very old school is Aiden.
I know the pain. But let's keep a good thought, because it's unlike him. You know,
yeah.
I've had the good fortune before, and he's a steady man when it comes to these responsibilities, so keep a good thought. Well, you know, we all have our personality flaws, I suppose, but being on time for a poetry reading. Check one more time.
Yeah.
In the meantime, I'll lock and load the 3-hour version of the book. I'll read a couple new poems.
Are you there? Of course you're here.
Ah, Jesus. Didn't I just say the thing?
All right.
Wait, Aiden, you're here, so.
I've been here since the start, Tom.
Good God, I'm glad. Let me then finish with this poem. Thanks be to God, Aiden. All I want to say to you is, you know, to have a room full of people who I can't see because of these lights, but listening kindly to these things I've said, it's a little bit like going to the shrink and not getting a bill for it. So I'd really like to say one more poem to you by way of compensation, and it has to do with a resolve I made many years ago now to write a sonnet on every birthday to mark the time we never feel going by, you know. So that was a resolve I kept for a year, as I recall. So, so I'll finish with this poem, which turned out on inspection after I'd done it to have 15 lines. Which proves the point I was trying to make, which is the older we get, the less we count. And you can try this at home. So the title of this miscounted poem is Refusing at 52 to Write Sonnets. Pretty catchy the way I turned that around, isn't it? The old lemonade out of lemons thing. It came to him that he could nearly count how many midwinters he had left to him in increments of 10 or, say, 11, thus 63, 74, 85. He couldn't see himself at 96, humanity's advances notwithstanding in health care, self-help, or New Age regimens. What with his habits and family history, the end, he thought, is nearer than you think. The future thus confined to its contingencies. The present moment opens like a gift. The blooming month, the bright week, the grey morning, the hours routine, the minutes passing glance, all seem like godsends now. And what to make of this? At the end, the word that comes to us is thanks.
Aidan Murphy published a book in 1987 with London publisher Alison Busby called The Way to Monaco's. On the date of publication, the publisher went bankrupt, and there was a big article in the Evening Standard newspaper, and the launch party was kind of like a week. And that book was reviewed by Herbert Lomas in Alan Ross's London magazine, along with Seamus Heaney's The Hall Lantern. And after giving Heaney a properly very nice review, Lomas said, "There is also room for these voices from the sump," which I will never forget because it was so true. Poetry normally is supposed to only deal with elevated things, but Aidan's poetry goes down into areas that poetry does not normally go to. On the Poetry International website, there's a piece on Aiden, which is featured on his publisher Dedalus's website, written by Patrick Cutter, which goes like this. There is a muscular male minimalism to Murphy's language, more influenced by the demotic of American verse than by the poetic speech of the British Isles. It is a male speech which avoids the asserted invulnerability of machismo. If anything, the male protagonists in Murphy's narratives and monologues are only too aware of their own fragility. I had the pleasure of getting to know Aidan and spend a lot of time with him in the London of the late 1970s and early 1980s. We'd meet often and share loads of poetry reading together. We read lots of the more alternative American poets, O'Hara certainly, but also Bukowski, Ed Dorn, etc. and lots of poetry in translation. Late 19th century French poets, Neruda, Vallejo, Ritsos, Cavafy, but not British or Irish poets as I remember it. Aiden's poetry often goes back to his native Cork, but it goes back in a kind of ghostly way. There are dance halls and nightclubs in the poems that no longer exist. There are ghosts in it. His new book, Wrong Side of Town, Dedalus 2015, the young Cork poet, or Tipperary based in Cork poet, Dean Brown, reviewing it, I'm going to quote from Dean's review: "While it seldom shies from the seedier paraphernalia of contemporary urban existence, its quiet refusal at the same time of cynicism and hardness, and how lightly worn the suffering is between its lines, are definite assets that demand recognition." Dean says that Aiden shows how the collection reports the ugly social injustice, while the relative sophistication of his attached outlook raises it above and beyond such mean, insular attitudes. And there's a mind-boggling thing in Dean's review. The reader bites down on such tales of emotional fission like a gravel sandwich. Aiden Murphy, welcome.
Thank you, Matthew, and thanks, Pat, and everyone at Munster Literature Centre for inviting me to air my new book for the first time in Cork. But before I do, I'd just like to read maybe 3 pieces from my earlier work. First one is from The Restless Factor, and it's a poem that I'm very fond of because it has become historically extinct. It was written during the old days of the old telephone kiosks, and button A and button B, and the difficulty it was to try to get through to somebody, and if you didn't get through, well, you just didn't get through. That was it. And it's called Touching Parallels. All night I dug for a reasonable word, a perfect verse hand-knit from salvage, a poem you might wear on a cold night. Now my notebook bulges with atrocity, the diary of a sick, unfeeling species. I want him on the line. My guilt wants to parley with his. My mouth wants to sing in his ear. I dial. The phone rings. Who'll deny this is a wicked moment, but there is no other? This fact assists my breathing down the deaf shell. He's in the shower. A wet towel trails across the tiles. Cake with soap, his hand is closing in on the receiver, and it freezes there. The instrument silent in his cradle. Clients queue outside, waving coins, itching to pile into these upright tombs for shots of hope. It's a poor service. Most will fail. Strangled by ruthless tapes, shamed by cybernetic language, double-crossed by gadgetry that never weakens our desires. This is from a book called Stark Naked Blues, which I wanted to call the Parkgate Book of the Dead, but was turned down. But I want to read the Parkgate Book of the Dead because I still think of it as the Parkgate Book of the Dead. And this poem, just to explain the background, is quite bizarre. It was written during the First Gulf War, and the protagonists are revenants from Egyptian mythology who are hiding out in this lock-in bar. They become barflies, and they're hooked to the TV all night watching the war, televised war. And I think the corporal general that's mentioned in the poem was a man called Stormin Norman Schwarzkopf, if I remember rightly. Now, oh dear, oh yeah, sorry. Part 8, Book of the Dead. Away from the scourge of daylight we sit, transfixed by man-made darkness and uncomplex calm in hieroglyphic poses. I am the jackal, confounded. You are the ibis, scarred by your greed for beauty. And we watch with other beasts, our lives departing into the tunnel of the original mystery tour. We drink to their final journeys, to the tattered passports of our souls, and pray that mercy has a sense of humour. Immured in space, voids of banter orbit between our elbows, feeding on photons of strain and silence, and all that was said before is said again, the reason and the rubbish, the smashing of promises in the cultivated language of destruction, while we suck each other's bruises and find each other always on a fallow footing. Once was the heady green of possibility, sprouting earthly peace. Once was an open book, loaded with restful heat, but the seeds of deceit had been placed, the white pages waiting to burn. Now as we relate our singular falls, browbeaten jackal to aging ibis, our eyes become a single eye, a telescope of pain and longing, scouring earth, sea and sky for our cunning. Now the screen hollers death in vivid Kodachrome, and the corpulent general informs the room that he also doesn't give a rat's butt. This is how it is, how it must be. The curb beyond the door is cracking, oozing gas. We drink again and breathe it in, and breathe it in, and breathe it in. And the last poem from the past is a poem which I wrote for, I was listening to a lot of Billie Holiday at the time, and particularly one song that really got to me, a song called In Your Solitude. And at the same time as I was listening to Billie Holiday, I remembered a 1973 album, I think, by Lou Reed called Berlin, which is probably one of the most disturbing albums ever made, contemporary albums ever made. Very hard to listen to. But track 2 on Berlin was a song called Lady Day. And in that he said, he opens it with, as she walked on down the street, she was like a child staring at her feet. And when she passed the bar, she had to go in and sing. It had to be that way. And I said, no, 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 Lady Day. So it was interesting, the fact that a gifted person, perhaps could they be happy if they, but she had to go in and sing, see, that was it. And the thing about that was that actually when I published this poem, I wanted to use the first verse of Lady Day, but apparently it was very expensive to buy, to write, so I had to leave it out, but I'm glad I got it in now. They can't get me now, right? So this is in her solitude. When she opened her mouth, there was an undiscovered country on her silver tongue, a weightless Eldorado, a place so sweet it dazzled devils to admit defeat. I feel, she said, like I am playing a horn. Across the street there was a door that opened into smoke and herbal darkness. Out of it poured the molten armour of angels, gilding the concrete and the young old eyes on tenement stoops, climbing the fire escape with fiery fingers towards our crushable, exploitable lips. They called it jazz, and it wanted her, as a vulture wants carrion. She left the safety of her room, descended the stairs, and crossed the street as if under a spell. "What's in there?" she asked the hooded man outside the door. "Why, lady, that there's hell," the man replied. She paused for a moment, overcome by fear and hurtful premonition. She would keep the golden sunburn locked forever in her throat. She would meet a good man who would love her and give her babies to love. She would sing to them at night and grow blissfully old and fat in a world miles from publicity and pain. But the moment passed. She walked right in and sang until she fell into her own and our blue history. I'll read some from my new book, Wrong Side of Town. First up, I'll read some from the second part of this first. Around 7 years ago, I found myself in a very difficult circumstances as regards finances and personal things, and I ended up renting what I can only describe now as an unadulterated kip. And I was 4 years there, and I was writing very little. But while I was writing, but scribbling, I didn't think much of what I was doing. But as time went on, I began to see a pattern emerging of almost like a map, a kind of a sketch map of my psychological state, and I filed it under carcass, I call it, and I put those pieces separate from anything else I might have writing at the time. So when it came, when I edited it down, a lot of it was dross, because when you write about things like that, a lot of it is the same. You're writing about the same thing. But I selected some of the more, what I thought were more varied aspects of this. So what I'm going to do, I'm not going to introduce. I'm just going to read through and think of it as a sequence. I sing the body unconscious, black pillows of sleep, the beautiful blackout that masticates our fears, the hours of blissful zero that cauterize all wounds. Come now, poem beast, here is the menu you drool for, the carcass opened up, the rib sheets aired, the heart sliced into chewy ribbons wet with tears, the bile spice cuts already festering, the blood, the marrow of the bone made sweet with sorrow. A pinch of this, a grain of that, I'm mixing cocktails in the den, attempting to correct imbalances. I shake and drain, I drip and grind, but I am no Victor Frankenstein trying to unlock the mysteries of life and death. I am just another urban warlock in a Nike baseball cap who wants to be happy for one whole day. I called her futility, my screwed up muse. She was smart as a whip at the start. Then she stopped dressing and sat in my lap for days, asleep on my shoulder. I didn't even try to get up, blessed in the comfort of her dead weight. Had I choice, I would have chosen to march south with the others, but I was ordered to remain here in this concrete whitewashed square, in the middle of this parched torch field, in this windowless box, with the twitching snout of a closed-circuit lens clamped high above a padlocked door, keeping watch on the flat-screen frontier, bones flying to dust, flesh falling to ghosts on the monitor. I must say, before I continue in a moment, but during the writing of this, I met with my friend Matthew Sweeney occasionally in Dublin, and he was aware of this carcass ongoing piece of writing, and we had a conversation one day that really stuck in my mind. He asked me how I was getting on with it, and I said I was waiting for that it was too dark. I was waiting for some glints of light to appear so that it would balance out. And fair play to Matt. He said that's a pretty good idea, because it did work in the end. It gets a little better towards the end. Food doesn't really bother me. I don't do dinner easily, or lunch much better. But don't ever mistake me for a man with no appetite. My brain is a glutton, obese, from the gristle of world and vision, and I have days when I could eat the planet, its outers, its innards, every tasty rancid crumb. black rhino. Not tonight, my love. I'm going outside to hide in the bushes because the dangerous cloud is passing through me and my bile is rising. Even here my skin is bristling as I watch the antics of the drunken guests behind the patio glass. I have to hold myself from charging. Best now to head up to the house I secretly built in the hills, where I can steam without burning. Why can't you let me stay broken? Anxious, you stay up all night, ruining your sight, consulting textbooks of malaise. But whenever you track down an illness that matches my symptoms, my sickness slides into another zone. Why can't you let me stay broken? Why can't you end your well-intentioned probing? Stop singing me out of my coma and bury me, bruises and all, deep in neutral waters. Showdown with the King of Sorrow. I know you, I've seen you blue-black crown before. You are the King of Sorrow, the monarch of grief, the potentate of despair in your cascading robes of tears and fears, staring at me from the bathroom mirror. Draw close to me, come closer still, until we're eye to eye, until I feel the weeping of your finery damp against my cheap sweatshirt, until I strike first with my fist and leave you smashed in jagged jigsaw pieces on the bathroom floor. Guardian angel. She could have kicked me out in snow, in rain and cold, but she was never one to raise a foot, a hand, even an eyebrow, at any man or woman on the far side of love. Instead, she eased me out with stealth, the long fingers of her left hand on my shoulder bone, her right index finger pointing upwards to the fleecy clouds, her merciful trickery diverting my gaze from the vortex below. And this is the last poem in that section. It's called The Grip. You advised me to let go. Thanks, but no thanks. Don't get me wrong. I know the tight holds we keep on family and friends, on lovers, dogs and cats, may bring us nothing more than grief and wrath. But when I watched my girl get sucked back up the water slide and disappear, I let her go. And when I watched my boy slouch through an ill-lit gauntlet of barbarians, I let him go. And when I saw myself get cynical and hard while plummeting from parapets of sense, I let me go. Too much letting go. From here I swear on dead friends' eyes to grip, the whole grip, nothing but the grip. How am I doing for time, Pat? No answer? Pat disappeared?
I just disappeared. Did I mention you have 5 minutes, Aidan?
5 minutes, man.
Yeah.
So, when I was 17 or 18 in Cork, there wasn't much going on in terms of poetry or library. In the library, had a very small poetry section, mainly, Keats, Byron, Wordsworth, Shelley, and I came across T.S. Eliot, whom I loved, but nothing very modern. But I knew older guys who, the kind of guys who wore duffel coats at the time, and also were rich enough to own jazz records. And one of them lent me a copy of Christ in London by Patrick Galvin, which really bowled me over at the time. And I had the fortune to meet the man. Many years later, I worked on one of his last collection of poetry, and on the three books of his biography. And we met on occasions, to chat. And I must say, I found this couple very, very, very pleasing. And after his death, I didn't write it straight after his death, but I eventually wrote a poem in memory. This is Quartet, in memory of Patrick Galvin. My mother enjoyed your brief company. She connected with your plain speak about the ragged citizens of poor Dunbar and Margaret Streets, the burdensome travails of shoeless Cork. For a time she stood her signed copy of Song for a Poor Boy in the place of honour, in the glass cabinet in the front room, and though she doesn't remember you now, or me, or anyone else for that matter, she used to post me newspaper clippings of those rare milestones of your late comeback. I recall, after the opening night of the burning of Bridget Cleary, long hours of wine and gin in Wynn's Hotel. You, me and Colette, me yapping non-stop about vintage film, reducing you to almost tears with tales of classic schmaltz, Stella Dallas, Mildred Pierce, Madam X, until we said our late, moist-eyed goodnights, and your phone call the following day, Murphy, don't ever do that to me again. Paddy, how many mad women of Cork were there? I think I saw at least a dozen spinning in circles at moonlit crossroads, and I heard of many others who went missing, bad with the nerves, they'd say. The blight was all around us, and I too jumped the boat across the water. But unlike you, I never found Christ in London, though I searched real hard. Did I dream it, or did your spirit pillow my shoulders with steady palms, and did I hear your flat Cork lilt inside my ear? Beware the trickery of the sun. Your enemies will come dressed as comrades. Be doggy wide. I read two more, one short and one little bit longer. This is called If I Were Cary Grant, and one of my favourite actors, a wonderful comic actor. And this is a sad love poem. It's about the end of an affair. If I were Cary Grant, we are trapped all girl inside this airless room. The temperature's unbearable and rising. The water levels inching past our waists. And as an added bonus, just in case, a sly explosive's primed to detonate. If I were Cary Grant, sweetheart, I'd spy above us in the nick of time a ventilator, a miraculous door. Then stooping low, I'd coax you in a baritone as smooth as pebbles rolling to a shore, to step up pronto on my manly back. But you and I, my dear, were reels beyond the glitzy swindles of the dream makers, the candy sunsets of the admin. The best this ending will allow us is a swift exploding into random bloody pieces of each other before we burn or suffocate or drown. And one little one to go. This is called Speed Date. Did you ever have sex so good, so intense, you wanted to kill or eat your partner? Me and my big mouth. When the awkward silence dies, which takes forever, she asks to be excused. I wait. Our foamy coffees shrink to stone-cold scum. Our chocolate sponge cakes capsize into pools of cream. I don't think she's coming back. Thank you very much.